Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us today in our monthly Roswell Park Center for Indigenous Cancer Research webinar series. This is an exciting discussion day. We have an entire panel from the University of Oklahoma who are going to share their thoughts on their respective programs. And normally we'd wait a little bit longer, but I see we have a pretty full house right now already, so we'll just have to hope that everybody can join in a little bit late and catch up. I want to make sure that our attendees here get their proper time today, because I'm sure they all have so many wonderful things to discuss with us today. So in no particular order, Dr. Jessica Blanchard is a cultural anthropologist at the University of Oklahoma's Center for Applied Social Research, where she is a director of the Center for the Ethics of Indigenous Genomics Research and co-directs the Genomics and Ethics program for Native students. Her research focuses on community engagement research, addressing the reduction of health disparities in Native American and African American communities, and particularly on issues of cancer, ethical and social implications of genomics, research, and community partnerships in health research. Dalakai Livingston is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Communication with research interests in health communication, conflict, cross-cultural communication, and deliberation. He is a research assistant and has been a fellow with the GEN program since 2019. Trinity Guido, Delaware, is a senior pre-med student majoring in community health with a minor in Native American Studies. She is a president of the Gamma Delta Phi Alpha chapter and was recently honored with the Outstanding Greek Senior Award, as well as the Anona Adair, I'm sorry if I did not pronounce that correctly, Award of Greek Excellence for her excellence in leadership. She has been a GEN Fellow since 2019. And finally, Justin Lund is a doctoral candidate in anthropology at the University of Oklahoma, where he also co-directs the GEN program. His research focuses on molecular anthropology, human health, biology, and bioethics. That was a mouthful. So I'm sure that everybody, with, like I said, your respective backgrounds are going to provide an excellent discussion today. So what I'll do now is I'll turn it over to Dr. Jessica Blanchard.
Thank you so much, William. Let me go ahead and share our screen. Can everybody see that? Okay, good. Thank you very much for having all of us here today. I know that all of us would love to be up there at Roswell Park with each of you. But for today, we're coming to you by way of different parts of Oklahoma, which is the traditional homelands of the Caddo Nation and Wichita and affiliated tribes, and now home to 39 sovereign tribal nations here in Oklahoma. So thank you again for having us. As William mentioned, I am at the University of Oklahoma, and I am here on behalf of the Center for the Ethics of Indigenous Genomic Research. And I think what I'd like to do today, since we do have a full panel, everyone else is going to talk about their experiences in our genomic and ethics program for Native students. And so I think before we get into that, I want to give you a little bit of background on our center in which that program is housed and the kind of work that we do here, and just a little bit on the background on the impetus behind this student research and training program, if you don't mind. So I am here again for our center. It's a mouthful. It's the Center for the Ethics of Indigenous Genomic Research. In short, we call it CIGR or CIGR. And that is a growing consortium of academic and community partners whose work with Indigenous communities spans across the United States. So here in Oklahoma, up to South Dakota, Alaska, Arizona, and beyond. So we have amazing partners all over. And the primary goal of our center is to identify and develop approaches to more ethical genomic research that align with the values and the interest and the expectations and the needs of the communities with whom we are partnering. One of the things about our center that I want to reinforce is that a guiding principle for the work that we do here is Indigenous sovereignty. That means that we support the exercise of tribal sovereignty over research. So keeping the design, the review, the oversight of research practices within specific tribal context and within specific tribal governance structures. And basically what that means is that that's going to look different everywhere. That's going to look different in all of our research partners. But it is a foundation for the work that we do. We take seriously that guiding principle, and we see that very much as a building block for doing better research. Upholding sovereignty in the conduct of research with Indigenous communities is key for us, as it should be for anybody who's doing work in or with Indigenous communities, upholding that sovereignty. Without that as a foundation, as a building block for research, relationships crumble. Without those relationships and without fostering those relationships, the research process dissolves. And then ultimately what that leads to is the benefit of research continuing to be elusive for many Native communities. And so in order to get to that benefit, we really need to maintain and uphold the importance of sovereignty as a building block for doing better research. And so that is a key principle for our center. And what that speaks to, I think important in understanding the story of that for our center, you have to kind of go back to probably a story that most of you here are familiar with, and that is the relationship between Indigenous communities and genomics and research, and knowing that that relationship is a complex one. It's one that is rooted in a legacy of scientific exploitation, biocolonialism, in some cases that persist. And so that is a complex relationship, but one that we are a part of hoping to change the narrative. And we also recognize that no matter how complex and complicated that relationship is or can be for some communities, it's not the same for every community. There's no blanket narrative here, and we want to recognize that. We also want to recognize that that relationship between genomics and research and Indigenous communities is a dynamic one. It's changing and in exciting ways. And one of the ways that we see this changing is the increased representation of Indigenous people in the field of genomics, shaping the field of genomics. And that was actually one of the primary reasons behind the growth of our center and the growth of this student research and training program. So the particular gap that we were interested in was that underrepresentation of American Indian Alaska Native students pursuing genomics or related fields. This gap is not new. It's not unique to genomics. But it is rapidly changing, as I said. And if I can, I'd like to quote a couple colleagues of ours, partners in our center, Doctors Katrina Claw and Nanaba Garrison, who wrote back in 2015, and I say that as if it was a long time ago, but even in the last 6 years, so much has changed. So they wrote this back in 2015. Quote, "The rapidly advancing field of genomics won't wait for Indigenous students to catch up. We need to be a part of the revolution now," end quote. And so our center, Seeger, is committed to supporting this kind of revolution in the field. And so we set out to create a space to provide research and training opportunities for Indigenous students to consider what the ethics of genomic research should be. Not what they are, but what they should be. It's aspirational, but it's intentional. It was never the goal of our training program to ease the transition for Indigenous students into genomics, indoctrinate them into genomics. That was never our goal. Our goal was to create a space for Indigenous students to bring their own perspectives, their own experiences together to reshape the field of genomics in ways that work for them and in their communities. Again, it goes back to, if the work you're doing does not work towards benefit for communities, it's time to reevaluate. And so I think there's two foundations, two sort of cornerstones, if you will, of the kind of work we do. It's upholding Indigenous sovereignty. It's also working towards community benefit. And so we created the GEN program, the Genomics and Ethics program for Native students. This is an R25 that was funded by the National Human Genome Research Institute as part of the ELSI program, and in conjunction with our CEER, our Centers of Excellence, which is Seeger, the center I was talking about. And so the primary interest of this is to consider the ethical considerations for conducting genomic research in Indigenous context. We knew that in order to create a space for our trainees to merge their own perspectives and experiences into this training process, that we wanted to prioritize Indigenous-based training. So you can see here in this graph, these are 3 of the main components of our program. We have mentorship, which is comprised of a lot of different things, community engaged research, and professionalization and service. And I must say that probably not unlike most of you here, the past year has caused us to approach these things in somewhat different and creative ways. And so we're still trying to figure out what that means, but also hoping that we can return to some of our original intentions of carrying out all of these things. So community engaged research, being in the community, going to meet and connect with people across the country and all of our different partner sites and with our different mentors. So I mentioned that, one of the original goals of this center was to provide Indigenous-based mentorship. And that's not going to come from me. As a non-native researcher, I knew that while I could facilitate the program, I wanted the connections and the trainings to be grounded in Indigenous perspectives. And so we devoted time before we ever had a student cohort into establishing what that mentor network might look like. And so we fostered connections with an amazing network of Indigenous mentors across the country and beyond, so not just in the US, who were on board with our goals and our motivations for the center. And these are Indigenous scholars, researchers, clinicians, community members who have all jumped on board and found value in this. And it was important in our efforts to establish that mentor network to find people that I knew were committed to these goals and some of the cornerstone principles that I mentioned, but that we could also create synergistic relationships with, and that our goals spoke to their efforts as well, and that there were opportunities to connect and to collaborate. And we've had that happen in some really amazing ways over the past 2 or 3 years. And so I want to go on and on about our network of Indigenous mentors, but without them, our program wouldn't be what it is. Here are 3 main characteristics, I guess you could say, of our program, and ones that we spend a lot of time trying to build and build up. And that is that we want this program to be cohort-based. We want it to be mentor-linked, as I mentioned, and also community-centered. And at the center of all of these things is relationships. We spend a lot of time trying to foster those within our cohort, between our cohort and mentors, and also connections with collaborating community partners and other student groups and native serving organizations across the country. I think the idea as we were building this program was that we want those who go through this program, when they leave this program, we want them to have a support system, to have a network to go into. So whatever they're transitioning into, we want to make sure that that support system is there to greet them and to walk them through whatever course they choose, whether that be going on to grad school, whether that be going to look for a job in academia, whether it be working in the private sector, going on to med school, whatever that may be. And so at this point, I think what I'll do is stop talking and let you hear from those who have been in this program. And this is not our whole Gen cohort that's with us today. So I just want to acknowledge our Gen students that are not with us here presenting today, but hopefully you're listening. But the ones here today represent the original cohort, and also my co-director, Justin Lund, who's really, without his assistance, this program wouldn't be what it is. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Guido, who will talk about some of her experiences.
Yeah, so hello everyone. There was a small introduction about me earlier, so I'll save some of that stuff, but I just wanted to add on that I am from Anadarko, Oklahoma. So it's a small tribal community in Oklahoma, and my other tribes that I'm also affiliated with. I'm a member of the Delaware Nation of Oklahoma, but I'm also Caddo, Kiowa, Comanche, and Fort Sill Apache. So I just wanted to add that on just for context of who I am and where I come from. So the first thing that I kind of wanted to talk about as far as my experience with the GEN program is about preparation. So this picture right here is actually from whenever we went to SACNAS, the SACNAS conference. I believe it was a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now. And that was actually in Hawaii that year. So that obviously offered some incredible opportunities to not only the experience to travel. I know for myself growing up, I didn't come from the most wealthy family. So I know these were the first times that I've ever really got to travel and see some of these different places and areas that I know that I would have probably never gotten the opportunity to. And yeah, so SACNAS, while I was at SACNAS, I was able to meet a lot of different schools. They had sort of like a college fair there, and it just provided a really good opportunity for me, because I'm a pre-med student, to connect with other med schools that were there and to sort of get my name out there. And I got, their contact information. It was mainly their diversity and inclusion booths that were there. So that was a really awesome experience to be able to, that I now have contacts at these different schools that, I would have never otherwise gotten the opportunity to do. Another thing that I have also been involved in while being involved as a GEN fellow is I've been really involved with the Association of American Indian Physicians. They have what's called pre-admission workshops, and it's basically just an application where you apply. And I actually had I think it was Justin, he looked over my application to help me make sure that everything was okay with what I was submitting for that program. And so when you're there on these pre-admission workshops with the Association of American Indian Physicians, you get extremely, extremely valuable opportunities to network with other Native physicians and their teams and other Native students. And you get to sort of see what it would be like if you were able to be, if you stayed on the path that you're on. And if I'm eventually admitted to med school one day, that's sort of an amazing opportunity to see myself through their eyes and sort of be able to have those experiences. They also offered like mock interviews, different interviews that we did we were graded on them. So that was really awesome. And they had like MCAT prep tips, and they had other Native colleges there that we were able to speak to that had different Indigenous health programs within their colleges. And we were able to network with those people. So that was probably one of the most valuable experiences that I've had thus far, because being within all these different spaces of these conferences and these different places that the GEN program has provided the opportunity to go to, the networking definitely is probably the most valuable thing in my opinion, because now once I'm ready to apply to med school and able to move forward, I know that I have help and I have support with not just people that are in the GEN program, but the people that they were able to bring in as well. So that was also a really awesome opportunity. So Jessica, if you could flip to the next slide. Okay, so another thing that I really wanted to talk about today was the research experience that I've been able to receive. This right here is myself and another fellow, Kaylee Edwards. This actually was regarding childhood cancer in Native American communities. And this was at a event. It was a community event where we were able to go and meet families. It was an opportunity to meet them and sort of see what that process looks like as far as field work for this. So that was really an awesome experience. Jessica was the one that actually provided this opportunity for us. And that is something that I remember hearing those families and their impact stories and just sort of feeling their emotions. It's definitely heart work. And, I was very, very thankful to be able to experience this. Not only because I can eventually put that on my resume one day, but because, this is the field that I want to go into. So this was really, really awesome for me to be able to experience. And with that, I was able to do like different note-taking trainings that were there throughout the time. And I also transcribed different interviews that we did with other families like through Zoom calls and things like that, because with the pandemic, we had to sort of not do as much work with that. But yeah, that was all thanks to Jessica, and that was a really awesome and amazing experience. And another thing with that, I think I'm interested in right now is pursuing a master's of public health, so, because that is what my bachelor's will be in. So I'm really excited to not only be able to use that for, just to be able to use that to help me with my applications to get into grad school, but also because that is something that I am very much interested in researching later on. So Jessica sort of opened that door for me with that. But yeah, so the next thing that I kind of wanted to also touch on that they kind of already talked about a little bit was just the community building that I have been able to experience within the GEN program. So we became really close as a cohort, and we were able to share really deep experiences that we all had experienced with the different times that we've been traveling and these meetings and these trainings that we would do. So in Native communities, that sort of aspect of our culture is really, really important. And I've been able to have that experience through the GEN program. And because of my leadership positions at the university within student-led organizations, I've been able to take what I have learned through the GEN program and offer that knowledge to pass that on to younger pre-med students that I meet and younger Native women that I meet, and even people that are not in university right now and that may want to be able to come back to school or go to school or need help with that process. I know that I've soaked up a lot of the information from what Justin and Jessica have really, really helped us with in learning. And I've been able to give that information to people that are going to be coming after me. So I think that that has a lot to do with just how our Native people in general relate to each other, and just because we're trying to always take care of one another with that different dynamic that is the Native culture. So I've definitely experienced that within the GEN program. It's like a passing down of knowledge, so to speak. And that's been one of the most awesome things that I have been able to experience. And I'm very thankful for that opportunity. And the last thing that I kind of wanted to talk about, obviously, is one of the main things that they offer is like financial support with different things that I have done. So I started a job as a nurse tech at the OU Medical Center. And I know I needed help with getting my BLS certification. So Jessica immediately helped me get that taken care of as far as like the fees to start that program and go ahead and get that certification. That was really helpful. And I know when the time does come that I do need assistance with like med school and paying for the MCAT and assistance with like the different application fees, she has already reached out and said that, we would be more than happy to help with that. So like I said, from somebody who I am a mother, I'm a student and I work. So not necessarily having to worry about the stress of how I'm going to pay for these things is really, really helpful to me when I'm somebody who definitely benefits from that. But yeah, so that's just sort of the things that I wanted to talk about with you all. This has been a life-changing program. I don't think that I would have been able to experience or feel as prepared and feel as impacted or impactful to others without this program. And that is just sort of my experience with the GEN program. And I hope that you took a little bit from what I have said today. But yeah.
Hello, everyone. I helped put together the slides, and I picked the most unflattering picture of myself, so that's how we're starting off today. My name is Dalakai Livingston. I am Dene and also white. My mother is white, my father is Navajo, and it is because of them I am here today for very specific reasons. And to give you some context and content behind the importance about relationships, first we need to know where I came from. First off, these are the mountains that I grew up looking at. I'm from Milford, Utah, and I came out to Oklahoma to do my PhD program. I'm a all-but dissertation, and my mother, my entire life, she was a nurse, and I saw her work tirelessly to help support our family. My father was a railroader, and he worked tirelessly to support my other 8 siblings and I. So there was a lot of us, and there's a lot going on. But she was a nurse, and I always saw how she took care of people. And I got to learn the culture when I had several siblings work at the hospital too as nurses' aides, and going up there visiting her late at night when she was working night shifts. And so this draw to health is how I kind of ended up focusing my studies in communication with health communication. Next, though, my father, Navajo, growing up, he was my coach, he was my dad, and it was slow going trying to learn about that because I was kind of, I had one foot in one place and one foot in another, but I never felt like I belonged in either. I just kind of was there to be a witness, never to be a participant. But this changed a lot as I grew up and as I went from my master's program to my PhD program. And while I was here at Oklahoma, I realized something when I was doing my research. It's really, really hard to be a student, and it's even harder to keep pushing, even though if we're focusing on the academic experience on the individual basis, it is very individualized, and it's that person's choices, and it's how they handle the consequences, etc. And that's what the emphasis on. And sometimes, though, being a Native student, it's really hard to get overlooked. I'm used to being overlooked for a lot of different things, and so that unfortunately permeates to other aspects. Something. My screen just, I think, moved out of the. Okay, all right, that's what happened. All right. I was like, whoa, what's happening?
Apologies, my bad. Go ahead. Sorry, Dalika.
But this is what I love about the GEN program. So by all intents and purposes, if we're doing the standards by academia has sent, I should have failed a year and a half ago. There was some struggles. There I had some issues with an advisor, and I just spiraled out of control. And it got to the mentality that the only reason I was in this program was because I was a diversity admittance. They just let me into my program because I was Native, which is disheartening because now that's really, it's a really hard thing to think about and try to come to terms with. And that's how I left my program for about a semester. And I was in a really dark place because of it. But here at the GEN program, this is where we emphasize relationships over those individual achievements. Maybe it's a little column A, column B when it's the GEN program, and also how incredible Jessica and Justin are when it comes to being directors, because they kept on asking questions. They asked questions how I'm doing. Even when I was in the school, like, hey, if you want to come back, we will help you every way that we can. And so these relationships that we forge, especially as researchers, they are the things that drive us to rise from those dark places that we might be in. And especially if you're going to be working with any sort of community that is historically and continuously underrepresented, and also when they're just easy to look over, you're not going to get very far in those communities that you're trying to reach. So with the emphasis on the GEN program, I am back in my PhD program. I've finished my comprehensive exams. I'm here and I'm doing research that matters. The stuff that we're doing, we're working with improving and understanding IRBs on a Native Indigenous level, which is very different. That was written several decades ago, and things have changed. And we as researchers also need to change. And myself as a researcher has changed. So an emphasis, just another example of the importance of communities, and especially grassroots type of research. Me and my fellow professor, James Ofuwate, over in the comm department, we did a research project focused on the resistant narratives of the polio vaccination in Sub-Saharan Africa. So even though, to a degree, science says that that immunizations, they work. I'm not saying they don't. But if you go to a community where you have notoriously used them, and also not only used them, but have done negative things in the name of science, or maybe with someone before them, people outside the country, and these negative experiences, they don't trust it. So how can you get these types of practices and these types of health, these types of health medicines and things that could save lives if there is not trust? And so with the GEN program, they teach us, they help and grow us and create these connections, so we start building these relationships. So this is where the future of any sort of research should be headed, is that when you're working with communities, you need to focus on the relationship between you and the research. They should be why you're doing this. It should not be for a dissertation. It should not be because it's interesting. It needs to give back to those communities. Now, there's a Navajo song, Justin, I'm going to say these words and it's going to trigger something for you. But go, my son, go and climb the ladder. Go, my son, make your people proud of you. And this song is about going and getting the education. And it's about once you start getting the education, you can lift up your nation as well. So here is what's fantastic and what I'm so excited about as we go forward with research, and particularly working with. That is the differentiation I want us to focus on. As we start working with and start emphasizing the importance of communities in research, that's when we can start start solving issues that matter. So going back to that example of Sub-Saharan Africa, when not only was there a lack of trust, they're like, hey, you need to take these polio immunization, you need to take these vaccines because they're going to save your life. And like, why would this save my life when we don't have food to eat? We don't have clean drinking water. We don't have A, B, or C. And so as researchers working with community, that is how you determine what the community needs. So we might come in with a bird's eye view and a top-down approach, but going in there and telling people what's wrong with their communities and how to fix them, that response and that type of relationship, there is a power differential that's just not going to help you as a researcher or the community. Now, I make this joke quite often that I am multiculturally born, and that's what I am. I'm multicultural. My mother from European descent, my father Navajo descent, but we can have a combination of both. We can have the best of both worlds here, where we can use Western practices of doing research, but also bringing in the Native perspective and their ways of knowing, and using those different types and combining them. That is how we move forward in these tough times. So here I am standing before you, a product of the Gen Fellowship. I am here today and I'm working on my PhD and I'm working on my dissertation, and the research I want to do, I want it to help my communities. I want my communities to live longer, to have stronger relationships. I mean, I come from a small town myself, so there's another injection of my background, why it's so important to me. I saw when someone got sick in a small town, I had a firsthand experience of family members and other friends. They'd come with casseroles, they'd come with food, they'd help pay for things when you couldn't. And it was all because they wanted to take care of you. And so as we transition from a top-down approach when it comes to research and put an emphasis on that community experience, this is when research is going to last longer than a paper, and it's going to echo through the generations and the next gen that we have coming up. So I'll go ahead and pass my time over to Justin. Oh, and that's all of us today. That's the first gen cohort. And Trinity and Asher and Noah and Kaylee, they, because of them, once again, I'm here. So thank you guys.
Thank you, Dalakai. You guys, my name is Justin Lund. I am very thankful for this opportunity to speak to you all and to echo what everyone's been saying here. I'm a PhD candidate in biological anthropology at the University of Oklahoma and a member of the Navajo Nation. I'm very happy to have been working with Jessica and the GEN program from the beginning, and I've seen it grow from a developing idea to what it is today. And my role with the GEN program started as a graduate assistantship, but it has too evolved. So speaking about evolving roles, that includes a little bit of everything about this idea of preparedness and this idea of relationships. I was here to help with the GEN program in any way I could and to help the program get off the ground, not to mention as a way to get a tuition waiver. But I did enjoy the thought of getting to work with a cohort of STEM-oriented Native students. For the program, I have been both a student and a faculty figure, and it's been a great experience. I am a first-generation college student, so suffice it to say, the images I had in mind for my academic journey and what it actually turned out to be are slightly different. Not in any good or bad way, just I had no idea, no way to conceive of what the journey would bring. When I was brought on to the Gen program, I really didn't have an idea of how much I would have to contribute, but it turns out there's a lot to be said for training people on how to be mentors. For me, that's what I've gotten from the Gen program. I'm learning how to be a steward of knowledge and how to bring people up with me. What sucks about an academic journey is the impermanence of it all. We have to move around and create new routes everywhere we go. And for us, the path is anything but clear. That lack of clarity is part of the game. The problem is that model of educating and learning can't be suitable for everyone. And I'd argue that it's much less suitable for people from underrepresented backgrounds. The structure only promotes success in those who can navigate the system well. And an underlying issue is that for an academic, our roles are constantly changing. We're students, we're TAs, we're professors, we're public figures, so many hats that we wear. That could be problematic for someone who might be inspired to the journey of academia out of a naive love for their field. I might fall into that category. Not to further romanticize our cultures in any way, but I believe it's true to say that Native people often have a grounding in self that has a strong tie to family and community. There are reasons for this that are many and too complex to really discuss here, but in academia, these types of strong ties can be few and far between. Not only because we move away to achieve success, but also because we are so outnumbered by non-natives. The Gen program works to make that world smaller and less of an obstacle to aspiring Native scholars. As part of the Gen program, I'm less of a scholar or a teacher, but more of a relative. I'd like to think of myself as a fun older brother or an uncle, but the importance of that role cannot be overstated. We all need a space to feel comfortable speaking up and asking questions, but we also need to feel comfort in not knowing the questions to ask. My role has evolved to be something I couldn't have really foreseen, and that is okay. My role was already on that path and I didn't even know it. I was leaving behind a life of a student for the role of a scholar, but I wasn't leaving behind my identity as a Navajo person, and sometimes academics can make it seem that way. Now more than ever, I find it important for all of us to find ways to ensure proper representation of diversity. For our communities to grow, Native and non-Natives alike, we need to value what makes us different and support those who are different. The Gen program is a tiny piece of that massive effort. The program supports the students in so many ways. We've met scholars from around the world and done amazing things that many students may have not had the opportunity to do. The Hawaii trip, for example, which was awesome. But you know, this type of investment in students speaks volumes, and I'm happy to be part of it. The program is called the Genomics and Ethics Program for Native students, but we are learning and teaching so much more than that, with the goal of positive change. Thank you for listening to us. We really appreciate this. I'll pass it on back to Jessica.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Let's see. Oh, there we go. So there is some contact information if you'd like to follow our journey and our activities. We didn't speak about a lot of the activities and trainings and topics that we do cover, but if you want to learn more about those, we have a website. We also are on Facebook and Twitter, or you can feel free to reach out to any one of us. So thank you again for having us. I will stop screen sharing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that all of our attendees today valued each one of your personal journeys. That was very inspirational. And to see the next generation of Indigenous students so passionate about their work. And I think to Dalakai's point, is emphasizing relationships over the research itself is such a poignant message that I think that us and our colleagues need to be constantly aware of and be mindful of, is that those relationships, without those relationships, research and the things that we believe to be of value doesn't work if the community doesn't feel that way, if the community doesn't feel trusted. And we often teach our colleagues about the struggles that we have working in our respective communities as well. And I think that this is deeply rooted. And oftentimes, and I think Justin had mentioned this briefly, is that sometimes academia and Indigenous values can clash. And it's difficult to navigate those waters at times, but to have a team of young and also seasoned individuals who are traversing these waters, these sometimes treacherous waters, and finding meaning and personal growth is really incredible. So I want to get to a couple comments before we get into questions, and feel free to type your questions into the chat box. We have a couple questions and a couple of important comments I want to mention first. I want to get to those before our questions, but one of our attendees had said, Dalek, I appreciate your frankness and what would be very vulnerable to share. To the rest of the speakers so far, very inspiring work and relationship opportunities. So thankful something like this exists. Another comment was, thank you for being so vulnerable and sharing your story, so inspirational. And it is difficult when you're in, I think most times it's difficult to speak in front of a crowd of strangers and be vulnerable and talk about your stories and your backgrounds. So we're very appreciative for each one of your stories. And so this is a question, it's a more scientific oriented question, and it's a little bit lengthy, so bear with me here. I'll do my best to do this question justice, but breast cancer is prevalent among Native women, especially more aggressive subtypes of breast cancer. What are some thoughts on academic researchers testing genetic ancestry of standard human triple negative breast cancer cell line models, MDA-MB231, MDA-MB468, and identifying them as having Native American ancestry, even with a small percentage? What is the most significant risk researchers pose using this approach in their research? Have you come across researchers who have said this before?
Wow, really great question. And I'm happy for anybody to jump in this. I will say that just as some background on me, I'm an anthropologist, right? So, so this is a little bit outside of my line of specialty, but I'll speak to a couple of the things in this question because it's a great question. I think that in terms of ethics, there are a number of ethical questions that go alongside any of those kind of genetic tests, especially for breast cancer that are specific, that aren't necessarily specific to Native populations. So let me just say that that's a whole other sort of host of ethical questions and concerns that should be considered. But I think to your point here in identifying individuals as having Native American ancestry, there are also some ethical questions here as well. I don't want to rank these or prioritize them in any sort of way, so I'll just list them and other folks can add to them. I think anytime you are associating elevated risk with particular populations, there is potential for group harm. And if you don't fully execute that or communicate that risk in appropriate ways, there can be unforeseen ethical problems that come from that. So that's one area, right, is the opportunity for group harm. The other area is that one other thing I mentioned in the beginning was that relationship between Indigenous communities and genomics research is problematic. And we've seen an underrepresentation of Native peoples in genetic research generally. That speaks for not just students, but also Indigenous researchers, although thankfully that is changing very rapidly. But one of the other areas of underrepresentation that we see is the underrepresentation of Indigenous peoples as participants in genomic studies. And so when you look at, for example, the range of GWAS, genome-wide association studies that are out there, I see some folks in the participant list that could answer this much more accurately than me, and Justin could too. I think it's like 96% of all GWAS studies include people of European descent. And so that raises a lot of questions about how applicable that kind of, findings from those studies are to other populations that aren't as represented in those samples. The other problem there is the accuracy or ethical considerations that come when using genetic studies to assign ancestry. Again, that often gets conflated with questions of identity, and that's incredibly problematic. I might actually turn it over to Justin here. I also see some folks in the chat who, if they wanted to unmute, that would be okay with me to speak to this. Why genetic ancestry testing is problematic as far as affiliation or identity.
Just briefly, I echo everything that Jessica says, and the where it becomes problematic for Indigenous people specifically, especially in the United States, is that our ethnic identity is tied to ideas of sovereignty and land, and so that's very different than other ancestral groups. And so that gets problematic politically. It gets problematic with ideas of enrollment and identity, as Jessica was saying. And so for those reasons, those kinds of studies usually have an issue somewhere deep. But yes, yeah.
Yeah, small sample size is just it's a big problem for a lot of different reasons. I see one of my colleagues, Amanda Janet's on here. She's doing some great work with regard to childhood cancer in American Indian populations. I would encourage you to reach out to her if you have interest in that. But we're currently grappling right now with how to pursue research in this area given small sample size. And what I would just say, and this, I have so many great Indigenous colleagues who say this much better than I do, but the bottom line is that small data is still good data. And so small sample sizes shouldn't be eliminated on the basis of just size alone. Do you mind, William, if I address this one question, just because I want to make sure we get to it before we run out, which is I see Renee Begay, and I also just want to say hello to Renee. Renee is one of these people that I mentioned in the beginning as changing this field of genomics in ways that represent Indigenous perspectives. So Renee is doing amazing work. You should go look her up as well. She asked, how do you think COVID-19 has or will impact conducting genetic research or outreach to Native communities? That's such an important question. I actually had planned to talk about this and just scrapped it because I knew we didn't have time. But you know, one of the things that concerns me when I talked in the beginning about the importance of upholding sovereignty in the research process. And I was thinking about this because recently, CDC released some reports recently about the impacts of COVID in different populations and communities. And obviously there's a disproportionate impact in Native communities in ways that are just not good. And that raises maybe a sense of urgency or a call for more research, right? More research, vaccination trials, urgency for new interventions, right? And I understand that sense of urgency, but that urgency cannot usurp sovereignty. And so before any new research takes place, you have to uphold that sovereignty through the research process. Sometimes that takes longer. That's okay. We shouldn't, during this time of crisis, and it is a crisis for sure, we shouldn't let that sense of urgency undermine sovereignty as we proceed. So how do I think COVID-19 has impacted it? A lot of different ways. I mean, you mentioned outreach here. All of our community engagement has stopped almost entirely. We've adapted the best we can to virtual formats, and we've maintained those relationships virtually. We've stopped all data collection in part out of respect because the disproportionate impact in Native communities. You have to take seriously those relationships. And when our collaborators are hurting because their communities are hurting, we can't act like data collection is somehow more important than that. And so out of respect, we've sort of stepped out and found other ways to spend our time over the past year, still fostering those relationships, but doing it in a way that's respectful and giving them space to do what they need to do. Out here in Oklahoma, tribes, as I imagine in other places, have just been leading. They're at the forefront of testing, COVID vaccinations. And so they've got other work to do right now that requires us to acknowledge that space. So I see Dalakai's got your hand up. Do you want to say something?
Oh, you kind of just said it to an extent.
Oh, my bad. Go ahead. Go ahead.
The outreaching to Native communities since COVID, I like to say that COVID exacerbated a lot of issues in healthcare, where you really got to see the differentiation between different populations and the necessity for a better infrastructure in a lot of ways. But I think this is one of those great opportunities moving forward where we can collaboratively work. So I think as COVID and the responses that Native communities had a good majority of them, I'm just like NPR did an article about why Native Americans are getting COVID-19 vaccines faster. Maybe also there's a the Wall Street Journal also did an article in reference to it as well about how these approaches to the COVID response has been a focus on community. And once again, this just reiterates the importance that Seeger and the Jen, they kind of champion. And that I think that's how moving forward, outreaching to Native communities, it might be beneficial to start those types of relationships and conversations like, hey, how can we replicate what you're doing and how can we help? And so once again, that bi-directional communication and also realizing that this learning and research process is collaborative. And I think that's really the future of research post-COVID, is such a strong emphasis on what worked and then trying to fix what didn't.
You know, I just briefly to dovetail off Dalakai too, I think, and to kind of address the question by Suzanne Hess, who asks, as young Native American researchers, what do we see as the greatest need and area of research for Native American communities? I think one of the greatest needs is these types of partnerships. And one of the reasons for that is to achieve this ideal of people being allowed to tell their own stories. And we don't often think about research and research reports as telling stories or being narratives, but they truly are. And we're at a point in time where there are Native researchers out there and we can be telling our own stories. And so identifying the best way to make these partnerships that Jessica and Dalakai have spoken of, and to identify these really positive and beneficial partnerships and attempt to recreate them is key, I believe.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to read a comment here. I'll just read this, so it's a little bit longer. One of the comments says, I appreciate you all for addressing my lengthy question. My name is Jennifer Dye. I'm a PhD candidate in the Center Biology program at the University of Arizona, Tucson, Arizona. A few weeks ago, a program seminar series had a guest lecturer claim these cell lines had Native American ancestry. As a Native Dene scholar, I did not know how to respond or unpack it, and ultimately didn't address it. Also, thank you for speaking out on all your experiences with your respective PhD programs as well.
Thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate that. And feel free to reach out to us, and I can give you a whole list of citations that address that very thing much more eloquently than I was doing a while ago. So I'm happy to share that resource with you. I'll put my email address in the chat, jessicawalker@ou.edu, and I can send you some things.
I also wanted to ask Trinity and Dalakai the same question that Justin had addressed, because maybe have some different perspectives on that. So as young Native American researchers, what do you see as the greatest need and area of research for Native American communities? Trinity, if you want to unmute and respond, we appreciate that.
Yeah, so in my opinion, kind of echoing what everybody else has said, there is a need for research and data and numbers in every sort of specialty and every sort of, really any sort of aspect that you would want to ever need. We need data in every field. So in my opinion, it is very important for programs like the GEN program to train these researchers to be able to do that work, because it's always much more appropriate and better, in my opinion, whenever you have actual Indigenous researchers that are working specifically for those communities. So that would just be my opinion on that.
Dalakai.
Very similar to what Trinity's talking about. There's a need everywhere, and I'll dovetail off that it's based on the community that you're working with. The needs of Dene is very different from needs from the Delaware, and there might be some similarities. The needs of the Cherokee, the Choctaw, even the Maori in New Zealand, like there are needs among the Indigenous populations, and understanding that, once again, it goes back to that community and that relationship building. And so, especially as a health communication scholar, I'm really big on developing those relationships, and so that's where I see that need. Hence why I'm in this area in particular. So I think the biggest benefit that we can do, especially as researchers, is just grow as much as we can in the tools that we have available, but then also be willing to change and adapt to whatever those communities might need. Because once again, it goes back to what those communities need. And thankfully, being part of those types of communities helps bridge a lot of those gaps. So something that I thought was that separated me from my communities is actually something that allows me to have a conversation between those communities. So that's where I'm at.
Thank you so much for your individual responses. And I think, Dalakai, you had another really important point that I think all of our attendees today should strongly consider, is that every Native community is different. Lumping all Native people into one category is sort of missing the point of really the spirit of our individual communities. And among the Haudenosaunee here in New York State, each one of our 6 nations is very different language, value structure, maybe somewhat similar, but the individual communities are different. And to create strong relationships, it goes far beyond research, and we have to actually honor those individual communities as sovereign. And I think Jessica mentioned that quite eloquently earlier in our discussion. So we're just about out of time. You know what I was thinking here, just in the future, if this group was open to it, I'd love to do a follow-up discussion, because I have a lot more questions and I think there's a lot more to be said. And maybe we can check in on your individual journeys as you're moving through the GEN program. We'd love to hear it. And there's so much content here. We're just not going to have enough time. And I see that Jessica had put a link in the chat box to the GEN program, I'm assuming, Jessica? Okay, great. So what I'll do is I'll ask each individual to do some final, maybe 1 minute worth of your final thoughts and discussions in the future moving forward for research in Indigenous communities. Trinity, why don't you go first?
So I just want to start by saying thank you to everybody that came and listened to us speak today. This was one of the first times that I've ever got to talk on a broader level like this. So it has been an absolute pleasure. And most importantly, thank you to Jessica and Justin for including me in this today. As I'm just echoing myself from before, it is very important to support programs in wherever you are at, whoever is on this call, whatever organizations or universities or different places that you may be involved with. It's really important to promote and support programs such as the GEN program, because they offer invaluable experience, super valuable experience for young Native students that may be going through things, because as we all know, university and colleges are a hard, vulnerable time for everybody. So it is just very important to invest in the future of those different perspectives of students. So that would just be my closing thing. So just, yes, support any initiatives that you ever come across, please.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming here, and I am so excited about the research we're doing. We were on a conference call the other day with Seeger, and we're talking about the ethical concerns about off-reservation urban Indigenous data collection, and the conversations they're having, like, well, this is going to change how we do research. And that's when it hit me. The students that you may have and the people that you're going to be working with, they're going to be the future of whatever field you're in. And so their experiences, those things, being there for them in ways that one of my advisors wasn't there for me before, that's going to make a world difference. So thank you so much for being here. Just remember, care about those, because they're the ones that are going to be taking care of you in the future.
Justin.
Thank you very much for joining us and listening to us. I really appreciate the attention. I know that any of our Indigenous colleagues out there completely understand what we're talking about. And I hope that our non-Indigenous colleagues out there can kind of start to get a grasp of some of these more complex issues that underrepresented people go through in trying to achieve success in academia. But we're happy to talk about it more, so get a hold of us anytime.
Excellent. And this will be recorded. The session is recorded. It'll be available on YouTube within a week or so. So once that's out, I'll share with the group here. You can share within your networks and share this wonderful discussion. Jessica, why don't you take us home here?
Well, I couldn't say anything better than what these guys have already said. So I Nyaweh for the invitation and the opportunity to speak here. I'll just say that, and that is wherever you go, for those of you that are students especially, make those connections, reach out, network, don't hesitate. And if it just means starting with us here, hey, that's a start, right? We'll get you in, we'll hook you in a network, right? Because those connections, you don't know how they're going to manifest years down the road. And even this opportunity here, I'm sure came my way because I had a connection to folks at Roswell Park through a completely different organization. So hats off to Rodney Herring and to Whitney Ann Henry, who I've known for years in another capacity. And yet here's this great opportunity that came from that. So you never know the opportunities that will come your way by reaching out and, connecting with people. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Nyaweh Scano, thank you everybody for attending today.